Ethan Carter sat in his office, staring at the latest wave of complaints from one of his company's main distribution hubs. Reports of exhausted workers, high turnover, and increasing shipment errors had been piling up for months. His senior managers had dismissed the concerns, insisting that the warehouse was simply adjusting to demand. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He had built Carter Logistics from the ground up, starting with a single truck and a promise of efficiency and reliability. Now, with dozens of warehouses across the country, his company was a leader in the industry, but something was clearly wrong, and he wasn't going to sit in an office and wait for another excuse. Ethan decided to see it for himself, not as the CEO, but as an entry-level temp worker. If his managers weren't giving him honest answers, he would get the truth another way. That evening, he shed his executive appearance. He ditched his tailored suit for worn-out jeans and a faded work shirt, roughing up his normally polished look with a bit of scruff. Thick-rimmed glasses and a slight slouch completed his disguise. His name tag would read Eric Collins, a nobody looking for temp work. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the warehouse as a new hire, blending in with the other workers waiting to be assigned. No one recognized him. Why would they? Most employees had never met him in person, and to them, he was just another worker looking for a paycheck. As he stepped inside, he immediately felt the weight of exhaustion in the air. Workers moved in stiff mechanical motions, no energy, no conversation, just relentless movement. The sound of conveyor belts and forklifts filled the massive space, but the silence between employees was deafening. A burly man with a permanent scowl approached him, a clipboard in hand. "You're on loading duty, no slowing down, no mistakes. If you fall behind, you're out," he barked. Ethan nodded, keeping his head down. He had no intention of falling behind, but as he took his first steps onto the warehouse floor, one thing was already clear. This place was broken, and he was about to find out just how bad it had gotten. Ethan stepped onto the warehouse floor, immediately feeling the crushing weight of the environment. The air was thick with the scent of metal, cardboard, and exhaustion. Towering shelves packed with packages loomed over rows of conveyor belts that moved with relentless speed, forcing workers to match their pace. The temperature inside was stifling, yet there was no sign of proper ventilation. Despite the constant motion of forklifts and the hum of machinery, the atmosphere was eerily silent. No chatter, no teamwork, just the sound of workers breathing heavily and pushing through fatigue. His new boss, Troy, the warehouse manager, was already proving to be as cold and unapproachable as Ethan had suspected. The man barely acknowledged him beyond barking a simple order: "Move faster or move out." His voice carried no patience, no encouragement, just pure detached authority. Ethan had worked tough jobs before, but something about this place felt different. The energy wasn't just tense, it was oppressive. He turned his attention to the workers. They moved like machines, their faces blank and drained, their eyes glazed over from exhaustion. No one spoke unless absolutely necessary. Even the sound of a dropped package, a box tumbling from a pallet, didn't earn more than a few tired glances before everyone quickly turned back to their tasks, as if acknowledging the distraction for too long might get them into trouble. Ethan was assigned to loading duty, responsible for moving hundreds of packages per shift. Within minutes, sweat trickled down his back as he struggled to keep pace. He glanced to his left at a worker, a young man who looked barely out of high school, already moving with the sluggishness of someone 3 times his age. His movements were shaky, his posture hunched, and his arms trembled under the weight of the boxes. Ethan's gut tightened. This wasn't just hard work, it was grueling. At one point, Ethan tried to slow down just enough to take a quick breath. Immediately, Troy's voice cut through the noise. "Keep up, temp. If you can't handle it, there's the door." Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to fall back into line. He needed to see more, hear more, experience more, but one thing was already certain. This warehouse didn't treat workers like people. It treated them like expendable tools. Ethan had barely settled into the grueling rhythm of the warehouse floor when he saw something that made his stomach turn. A worker a few feet away, a young man no older than 20 with dark circles under his eyes and a sluggish gait, was struggling to stay on his feet. His breathing was labored, his movement slower than the rest, and every few minutes he would wipe his forehead with trembling fingers. Ethan watched as the worker Jesse staggered slightly, trying to push through his exhaustion. Then it happened. Jesse collapsed, his body crumpled to the floor with a dull thud, his arms knocking over a stack of boxes as he fell. For a moment, No one reacted. The conveyor belts didn't stop, the machines kept humming, and the workers hesitated as if unsure whether to help or keep working. Then, Troy sighed, barely glancing at Jesse's unconscious form. Someone dragged him to the break room. His tone was indifferent, like he was talking about a broken piece of equipment, not a human being. Ethan froze, his hands curling into fists. "Shouldn't we call for help?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. Troy finally looked at him, his expression unreadable but his tone firm and dismissive. "He'll be fine. Happens all the time." Before Ethan could argue, Mia, one of the team leads, rushed forward. She ignored Troy's apathy and knelt beside Jesse, her voice laced with worry. "Jesse, can you hear me?" When he didn't respond, she sprinted to grab water while Ethan crouched next to Jesse, watching his shallow breathing. Mia returned, gently pressing a water bottle to Jesse's lips. After a moment, his eyelids fluttered open, and he groaned. "You need to rest," Mia told him. Jesse let out a weak chuckle, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can't. Need the hours." Ethan's stomach twisted. The lack of concern, the forced exhaustion, the fear of missing work. This wasn't just a tough job. It was a system designed to break people, and he wasn't going to stand by and watch it happen. Ethan forced himself to push through the rest of his shift, determined to see just how deep the warehouse's problems ran. The more he observed, the clearer it became this wasn't just a tough work environment. It was a pressure cooker, forcing workers to their limits with no regard for their well-being. The fear of losing hours or being labeled as slow hung over everyone like a dark cloud. When the scheduled break finally arrived, Ethan followed the others into the cramped and unwelcoming break room. Instead of a proper rest area, it was a dingy corner of the warehouse, with only a few battered chairs, a vending machine that was half empty, and a water dispenser that barely worked. Some workers sat against the walls, eating in silence, while others opted to stand, too exhausted to even chat. Ethan spotted Jesse, still looking pale, sitting on the floor in the corner, with Mia beside him. She was speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "You need to take a day off," Mia told him. "You're going to pass out again." Jesse let out a weak laugh, shaking his head. "If I miss another shift, they'll cut my hours. I can't afford that." Ethan clenched his jaw. How many workers were in Jesse's position? Pushed to their breaking point, knowing that taking care of themselves meant risking their income? As Ethan adjusted his position, he caught sight of a stack of payroll sheets left sitting on a supervisor's desk nearby. Pretending to fix his shoe, he took a quick glance at the numbers. What he saw made his blood boil. Workers were making barely above minimum wage, with overtime pay inconsistent or missing entirely. Some employees were clocking over 50 hours a week, but their paychecks didn't reflect it. He took a deep breath. This was more than just harsh working conditions. This was outright exploitation. Before he could process his frustration, a young worker, no older than 20, poked his head into the break room. His posture was stiff, his voice barely above a whisper. "Troy wants you all back early." Mia's expression darkened. "We still have 5 minutes." The young man shrugged. "He says we're behind." Ethan exhaled slowly. They weren't even allowed the full break they were given. This wasn't just bad leadership, this was systematic abuse, and he was going to put an end to it. As the shift dragged on, Ethan rotated through different tasks, trying to piece together the full scope of the warehouse's dysfunction. It wasn't just the exhausted workers or the lack of breaks, there was a bigger issue at play. When he was assigned to the shipping department, he noticed something alarming. A worker named Leo, stationed at the quality control area, was frustratedly pulling defective packages off the conveyor belt. His pile of rejected shipments was growing larger by the minute. Ethan approached him, keeping his cover. "What's wrong with them?" he asked. Leo snorted, shaking his head. "Measurements are off. We're moving too fast and nobody double checks before these get packed." He held up a shipping label. "This order's missing parts. If it goes out like this, the customer's going to send it right back." Ethan frowned. "Doesn't anyone check before they leave the warehouse?" Leo let out a bitter laugh. "I've told Troy a dozen times. He doesn't care. He just wants the numbers. If I slow things down to fix them, he says I'm holding up production." Ethan's stomach churned. This explained everything. Customer complaints about delayed shipments, refunds, and incorrect orders. His company's reputation was taking a hit, not because of bad employees, but because of bad management. He watched as Leo hesitated before reluctantly placing one of the defective packages back on the line. "You're just gonna send it?" Ethan asked, surprised. Leo sighed. "If I don't, I'll get written up. And if I get written up too many times, guess what? No more hours." Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't just a management issue. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Workers were so afraid of losing hours that they were forced to cut corners, even when they knew the shipments were wrong. He had seen enough. It wasn't just about overworked employees anymore. His company's entire logistics system was compromised. And Troy was the one letting it happen. Ethan had seen enough. The exhaustion, the unsafe conditions, the blatant disregard for quality, and the fear-driven work environment, it was all coming from one place: Troy. The man who ran this warehouse like a sweatshop, prioritizing numbers over people, speed over safety. But the final straw came at the end of Ethan's shift when he saw Troy cornering Mia near the loading dock. Troy's voice was low but sharp. "You're getting too comfortable, Mia. Too many breaks, too much talking. If you want to keep your hours, I suggest you start acting like you care about this job." Mia stiffened, her hands balling into fists. "I've never missed a quota," she said evenly. "I do my job." Troy smirked. "That's not the point." Ethan felt his blood boil. He had spent the day keeping his cover, observing, listening, gathering proof, but now he was done watching. Taking a slow breath, he straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and spoke. "Mia, take a break." Mia turned, confused. Troy did too, his brows furrowing. "Who the hell are you to give orders?" he demanded. Ethan reached up and removed his glasses. The hunched posture he had maintained all day was gone. His voice, now carrying the weight of authority, rang across the warehouse floor. "I'm Ethan Cotter." The warehouse fell silent, the hum of conveyor belts, the beeping of forklifts. Everything seemed to pause. Workers stopped what they were doing, turning to stare. Troy's face was drained of color, his mouth opened, but no words came out. Ethan took a step forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "You've been running this place like a sweatshop. I watched you push workers past their limits. I saw you ignore safety concerns. And I know you've been shipping defective products just to hit numbers." Troy swallowed hard. "Sir, Save it," Ethan cut him off. His eyes burned with controlled fury. "You're done here." A murmur spread through the workers. Troy sputtered, looking for an escape, but there was none. Ethan turned to one of the floor supervisors, the only one who hadn't looked completely indifferent all day. "Get his keys. Security will escort him out." Troy's jaw clenched, but he knew he had no power left. Reluctantly, he handed over his badge. The weight in the warehouse shifted. For the first time all day, the workers didn't look afraid. As Troy was escorted out of the warehouse, a hushed silence lingered among the workers. No one moved, no one spoke. They were still processing what had just happened. For years, they had been pushed past their limits, ignored, and treated as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. And now, in a single moment, their tyrant was gone. Ethan turned to face them, his expression serious but steady. "I know you've been mistreated. I know you've been pushed to exhaustion, afraid to speak up because no one would listen." His voice was clear, carrying through the massive warehouse. "That ends today." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. They had heard promises before, but this was different. The CEO of the company wasn't just talking to them, he had been one of them. Ethan continued, his gaze scanning the room. "I saw it all. The unfair cuts to hours, the ignored safety concerns, the way you've been forced to work through exhaustion just to keep your jobs." He paused, then gestured to the shipping area. "And I saw the shortcuts being taken, the faulty shipments, the rushed quality checks. All because management cared more about speed than doing the job right." Murmurs spread through the workers. They knew it was true. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm making changes, effective immediately. Overtime will be tracked and paid fairly, breaks will be mandatory, and anyone caught forcing workers to skip them will be out, just like Troy." A few workers exchanged glances, still skeptical. Ethan nodded toward Mia, who stood near the loading dock, still stunned. "And I need new leadership here. Someone who actually cares about the people keeping this place running." He met her gaze. "Mia, would you be willing to step into a leadership role?" Mia's eyes widened. She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "If it means making things better?" "Yes." For the first time, workers started nodding. A few even clapped. Ethan knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. As the tension in the warehouse settled, a new energy began to take its place. The workers, once hesitant and wary, were starting to realize that real change was happening. Ethan knew that firing Troy wasn't enough. If the company was going to move forward, it needed strong, compassionate leadership, and he had already seen the perfect candidate in action. Turning to Mia, he took a step forward. "You've been looking out for your team long before I stepped in today. You care about the people here, and you're willing to stand up when things aren't right." He met her gaze. "I want you to step into a leadership role. Effective immediately, you're the new warehouse supervisor." Mia's eyes widened in shock. "Me?" she stammered. "But You've already been doing the job," Ethan said with a small smile. "Now you'll have the authority to actually fix things." A murmur of approval spread through the workers. Slowly, nods of agreement turned into claps, and then full applause. Mia swallowed hard, then straightened her shoulders. "Then I'll do it, but only if we're actually going to make this place better." Ethan nodded. "That's exactly the plan." He then turned to Jesse, who still looked pale from earlier. "And you? You're going home for the rest of the day, with full pay." Jesse's eyes widened. I can still work?" "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "No one should have to push themselves until they collapse." He looked around at the others. "That's not how a company should be run, and starting today, it won't be." For the first time, the warehouse didn't feel so cold. People breathed a little easier. But Ethan knew his work wasn't done. This wasn't just about one warehouse. It was about fixing a broken system across his entire company. And that was exactly what he intended to do. The following weeks marked a turning point for the warehouse. With Troy gone and Mia stepping up as supervisor, the toxic culture that had been ingrained in the workplace began to unravel. Ethan didn't just issue orders from the top. He stayed on site, working alongside employees, listening to concerns, and ensuring that every promise he made was carried out. One of his first major changes was mandatory protected break times. No more intimidation, no more early return demands. Workers finally had the chance to rest without fear of losing hours. He also implemented strict overtime tracking to prevent wage theft, ensuring that every extra hour was properly compensated. Ethan also tackled the shipping crisis. He met with Leo, the shipping coordinator who had flagged defective packages, and assured him that quality would now take priority over speed. Rather than cutting corners, Ethan streamlined the process so that orders were checked properly before leaving the warehouse, reducing the number of customer complaints. The physical conditions of the warehouse improved as well. A new cooling system was installed, and the previously neglected break room was expanded and stocked with proper seating, food, and cold water. Workers, once silent and drained, began talking, laughing, and moving with more energy. The fear of losing their jobs for speaking up was slowly fading. Mia, now in her leadership role, proved to be the right choice. She balanced efficiency with empathy, making sure that productivity remained high without sacrificing worker well-being. When Jesse, now fully recovered, needed a day off for personal reasons, she approved it without hesitation. For the first time, workers felt valued. But Ethan knew this wasn't just about fixing one warehouse. If these issues were happening here, they were likely happening elsewhere in his company. So he expanded the changes company-wide: independent audits, direct reporting lines for employees, and a complete overhaul of leadership training. Bad managers would no longer be protected, and employees would have a voice. The results spoke for themselves. Turnover rates dropped, efficiency improved, and workers finally trusted the company again. Ethan had saved more than just a warehouse. He had saved the culture of his business. 2 weeks after the shakeup, Ethan returned to the warehouse unannounced. He had made plenty of changes, but real leadership wasn't about giving orders from afar. It was about making sure those orders actually worked. As he walked the floor, he immediately noticed a difference. The tension that once hung over the warehouse like a storm cloud had lifted. Workers moved with purpose, not fear. They took their breaks without hesitation, and conversations, once non-existent, filled the space with energy. Then, something caught his attention. A young man in worn-out clothes stood hesitantly near the entrance, shifting his weight nervously. Ethan recognized the look. It was the same uncertainty he had seen in Jesse before he collapsed. Before Ethan could step in, Mia beat him to it. She walked over with a warm, reassuring smile. "Hey, you here for the new hire orientation?" The young man nodded cautiously. "Yeah, I've never worked a job like this before." Mia's smile didn't fade. "No problem. We'll get you trained, and if you ever need anything, just ask. We take care of each other here." Ethan watched as she led him inside. No condescension, no intimidation, just kindness. And in that moment he knew the culture of fear was gone. The changes weren't just policies on paper, they were real. Ethan exhaled, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. This wasn't just about productivity or numbers, it was about people. And now his warehouse was finally a place where people mattered. As Ethan stepped outside the warehouse, he took one last look at the building that had once symbolized everything wrong with his company. A few weeks ago, this place had been a machine that drained the life out of its workers, a place where exhaustion was expected, complaints were ignored, and fear ruled the floor. But now it was a workplace where people felt valued, where their concerns were heard, and where leadership actually cared. Ethan had learned a hard but necessary lesson. True leadership isn't about sitting in an office reviewing reports. It's about being on the ground, understanding the struggles of the people who keep the company running, and making sure that respect and fairness aren't just words in a mission statement. If he had trusted the managers above him without seeing the reality for himself, nothing would have changed. And change wasn't just about firing bad managers or enforcing new policies. It was about creating a culture where employees could trust leadership again. He had done that here, but he knew his work wasn't finished. This was just one warehouse. There were others across the country, each with their own challenges, their own stories, and Ethan had no intention of letting them fall into the same neglect. As he walked toward his car, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never allow himself to become disconnected from his employees again, because at the end of the day, his business wasn't built on numbers, quotas, or shipments. It was built on people, and he would never forget that again. The story of Ethan Carter's undercover experience reveals a powerful lesson in leadership, accountability, and the value of employees. It demonstrates that a business isn't just about numbers and efficiency, it's about the people who make it run. Ethan had relied on reports and assurances from upper management, but only when he stepped onto the warehouse floor did he truly understand the toxic environment his workers endured. One of the key takeaways is that bad leadership at the management level can poison an entire workplace. Workers weren't failing because they were lazy, they were being overworked, ignored, and pushed to exhaustion. It took a leader who was willing to see the problems firsthand and take action to bring about real change. The story also highlights the importance of trust and fairness in the workplace. When employees feel respected, valued, and heard, they are more engaged, more productive, and more loyal. By promoting Mia, implementing fair policies, and removing toxic leadership, Ethan didn't just fix one warehouse, he transformed the culture of his entire company. Ultimately, the story teaches that real leadership means staying connected to your people. A great leader doesn't just issue orders, they listen, they learn, and they lead with integrity.